Okay, now let's test a component that uses a router for navigation. So let's go to this user details folder and open this component. So in this component, when we click the save button, we are going to take the user to the user's page. Now, there are two ways to test this behavior. One way is to write an interaction test. So we can write a test to ensure that the navigate method of the router is called with the right arguments. So we're testing the interaction of this component with one of its dependencies, just like testing the interaction of a component with a service. So when a component is using a service to talk to a backend API, we can test the interaction. So we're going to use the same approach here. However, this does not guarantee that the navigation is going to work. For example, we may forget to define a route for this path. So we need to write another test to ensure that we have a route for this path. So this is approach one. We write two tests. One to ensure that this component is interacting with the router properly, and the other to ensure that we have a proper route. Now there is another approach to test this behavior as well. Some developers prefer to use a real router object and then ensure that routing is happening properly. So instead of testing the interaction, they write an assertion against the current URL in the browser. Now, I personally do not like that approach for a few reasons. The first reason is that it tests the router class in Angular. So it's like we're writing a test for the Angular framework, not for our application. Plus, this kind of test would require a bit more setup code, and it's very error prone. I personally have not had much success writing this kind of test. So my preference is to test the interaction of this component with the router. So let's go ahead. Open up the spec file. Now, if you go on the top, you can see that I have excluded the test for this component. Let's remove this. Save. I want to show you an error that we get before writing any test here. Okay, here's the error. No provider for router. And this error happens on this line here. We cannot even create an instance of this component. So to fix this error, we have two options here. One way is to import the router module, but that would make this test work with a real router. I don't want to work with a real router here because it's going to add some complexity in our setup code. We have to register routes, we have to change the declarations, and also this is very error prone. We get various kinds of errors for the router not working properly in this environment. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you a technique for creating a fake router, which we call a stub. This is a technique that you can use in a lot of tests, not necessarily related to routers. So anytime your component has dependencies and providing those dependencies is going to be complex, you can provide a fake implementation. So I'm going to go here. Before the describe block, I'm going to declare a class called router stub. Now here, I'm going to create a dummy and lightweight implementation of the router class in Angular. So let's go back to our component. Here we're using the navigate method of the router class. So I'm going to add a navigate method here. That's going to take some parameters. And I'm going to leave the implementation empty. It's a dummy implementation. That's why we call this class a stub. Now we don't need to add all the other methods of the router class. We only need the methods that we have used in our component under test. So back here to the configuration of our testing module, I'm going to add providers. Now here, I want to tell Angular to replace the router class with our router stub. And for that, we use a special syntax. So previously, we just added a name of a class here, like router, and this would register this class as a provider. Now we're going to supply an object. This object needs two properties. One is provide, and here we add our router class. Now I need to import it on the top. So import router from @angular/router. The second property of this object is use class. And here we add router stub. So with this, we're telling Angular that when it sees router as one of the parameters of the constructor of our component, it should create an instance of the router stub class. So here's our component. When running our tests, Angular is going to supply an instance of the router stub instead of the router here. Now look at the second parameter in this constructor. It's the activated route class. So similarly, we should create a stub for the activated route. So back in our spec file, I'm going to create a class, activated route stub. Now what members do we need here? Let's go back to our component. This is the line where we are using this activated route. So we're using this params property, which is an observable. So this is the only member of the activated route class that we have used here, and we need to add it to our stub. So I add params here, which is an observable. Now let's import the observable from rx.js. Okay, now back to the configuration of our testing module. I'm going to duplicate this line and change this accordingly. So for activated route, use class activated route stub. Now we have a compilation error, so we need to import the activated route class. On the top, I'm going to import it here, activated route. Now let's save and see if we can create an instance of the component under test. Okay, we got an error, cannot read property subscribe of undefined. The reason we got this error is because here we're subscribing to this observable. However, back here in our stub, we have not initialized this property, so it's undefined. So let's initialize this to an empty observable. Okay, save. Okay, beautiful. All tests are passing. So now we can create an instance of the user details component.